Following program is a production of the Hennepin County Library.
Hello, welcome to our discussion. I'm Tom Nelson. I'm with the law firm of Popham, Hicks, Schnobrook & Kaufman here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm here today with Steve Gillon, who has just recently written and now published a book called The Democrats Dilemma, Walter F. Mondale and the Liberal Legacy. Welcome to Minneapolis.
Thanks, Tom.
So you've been to Minneapolis, I'll bet, in connection with this book a good deal lately.
That's right. I spent 5 years researching the book and spent a lot of time at the Minnesota Historical Society. Mondale has some 1,300 boxes of material there, personal papers, which I had to plow through. And it's actually, the Minnesota Historical Society is a wonderful collection of materials related to the DFL, to the Democratic Party, to liberalism. There's the Humphrey papers, Freeman papers. So I spent a lot of time here, and there's also many old Mondale hands who are in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area who I've gone around and talked to. So made many visits and have enjoyed them all.
Well, it's a thorough and careful book, and I have to say I very much enjoyed reading it and respect the work that you've done on it. Let's take a minute before we talk about the book. Tell us a little bit about your background. How did you happen to end up in the business of writing and publishing a book?
Well, I went to graduate school and decided I wanted to be an historian. And my major interest was the post-New Deal, national politics. And I wrote my dissertation and my first book on a group called the Americans for Democratic Action. And when I finished it back in 84 or so, 85.
Where were you in school then?
I went to Brown University, and I finished my PhD in 85 and went to Yale and have been there since. And I had felt that I had just skimmed the surface of these issues. I wanted to look at the central question, I guess, that was driving me was what happened to the New Deal coalition and what happened to post-war American liberalism. Why do I remember Lyndon Johnson launching a war on poverty, and why was I watching Ronald Reagan assault that war on poverty? What took place in American politics that brought about that change?
Thinking back, what is it that piqued your interest in that? What is it about those topics or those questions that got you going?
I think a lot of it was just my background. I grew up in a working class, ethnic community in Philadelphia, right outside of Philadelphia. And most of my friends and the people who I grew up with, and my family, were Democrats in the Roosevelt tradition who fled the party in the 1970s. And I tried I understood, I think, some of their concerns and their problems with the Democratic Party and with liberalism, but I wanted to understand better why they fled the party and understand what impact they were having on the Democratic Party and on national politics. So it was, in a way, trying to explain my background to myself and to reconcile these two very different worlds that I lived in. One, the liberal Ivy League world of Brown and Yale, and the other, this working class ethnic community. And this book and my other work in dealing with liberalism, I think, is a way for me to reconcile this tension in my own life.
You refer to Mondale as a transitional politician, and I think as well we often talk these days about the generation being in generations being in transition. Which generation do you come from? For example, what age are you right now?
I'm 34.
All right.
So I chronologically belong to the younger generation, but intellectually and emotionally, I feel very much a part of the older generation. I think that it's two generational experiences. The generation whose view of politics was shaped by the Depression and World War II, and on the other hand, the generation whose experience was shaped by the 1960s, by Vietnam protests, the Civil Rights Movement. And I think it has led these two generations to very different prescriptions for the American economy and for our nation in general.
Also different from the follow-up generation, I take it, the generation of the 70s and the 80s?
I don't know if, I think I see the 70s and 80s as a outgrowth of the 1960s. really a backlash against the 60s. People learned different lessons from the 1960s. And I think most of the people who came of age in the 70s and the 80s were coming of age at a time when people were trying to figure out what happened in the 1960s. And they're either for or against it. But I think it was the experience in the 1960s that defined that generation. And whether they are conservative or liberal, one way or another, they're trying to make sense of these issues that arose during the 1960s. Issues much different from the older generation.
As a member of that generation, I can tell you, I think you're right. And it often doesn't have to do with whether you're conservative or liberal, but at least you were formed then.
That's right. It's really, the question is more, what's your view of the 1960s? Will, I think, give a better indication as to whether someone's a Democrat or a Republican, and what party they vote for. And one of the things that attracted me to Mondale was that he was one of the people who tried to bridge that gap in the party. He was someone who tried to forge a consensus, who tried to find some common ground between these two very different factions within the party. And he failed, obviously.
When you stumbled on Mondale as the topic, and as a historian, let me ask you this, did you set out to figure out whether you agreed with Mondale in terms of his policies or his politics, or just to figure out and then explain Mondale?
Well, that's a good question. I think my first objective was to figure him out and try to understand him. And as I spent more time trying to understand him, I became more sympathetic to his plight.
It's an interesting word to use. Tell me what you think how would you describe his plight?
Plight
may have changed over the years, but what would his plight
His plight is how does a very bright, very decent, committed, dedicated public servant try to adjust to a political environment that is fundamentally different from the one in which he was raised. Walter Mondale was raised in the Harry Truman, Hubert Humphrey tradition, deeply rooted in the DFL, and in a sense of class struggle that defined the DFL and the Democratic Party during those years. But he came to national prominence really after 1968, at a time when social issues were much more on the public's mind. And a time
social issues as compared to class issues.
Class issues, that's right. I think that the whole generation that experienced the Depression came to identify the Democratic Party with the party that would paid attention and cared about the economic interest of working class, middle class Americans. It was a party that saved them from starvation, provided them with work, provided them with benefits, and helped them survive the Depression, provided them with the GI Bill, saved us from Hitler. And it was this strong sense of class consciousness that created the glue that held these disparate groups together. But that glue came undone in the 1960s when these cultural issues, and especially race, I think more than any other issue, race, diluted that class glue. And it made poor people, poor white people, look not to the wealthy and to big business as the enemy, but to black people. And Walter Mondale, who grew up with this sense of class consciousness and class struggle, suddenly had to deal with these new issues and these new constellations of voters. And I don't think he and until now, until Bill Clinton, no one else, I think, has learned what the new formula is. I think if there's anyone who seemed to have the answer, it was probably Robert Kennedy, but he never had the chance to realize it.
When you were learning about Walter Mondale's background, did you have a chance to meet people with whom he had worked over the years?
I did, yeah. I think one of the wonderful things about doing a biography of someone who's still alive and a contemporary is that you get to interview people, you get to talk to people. And as an historian, we spend a lot of time going through papers, looking for a paper trail. But what I learned from doing this is that you can only learn so much from paper, especially in this age when people do very little on paper. They talk on the telephone. And there's so much that you miss, so much that you never understand. I just think of my colleagues who do medieval history and colonial American history, who were forced to deal with just physical artifacts from a period. And I had the advantage of going around and talking to people who had memories.
Who were some of the more interesting characters that you met?
Well, there's a lot of them in Minnesota. The people who were most insightful and just most understanding of Mondale, there were really three of them. Dick Moe, who was a former DFL head and later Mondale's chief of staff when he was vice president. Mike Berman, who has been with Mondale since Mondale was attorney general in the early 1960s. And Jim Johnson, who was Mondale's campaign manager in 1984. Those three people over a 25-year period were with Mondale all the time. And they have tremendous insight into him, wonderful memories of events which otherwise would go undocumented if they had.
What were some of the more surprising insights regarding Walter Mondale? Ones that you might not have expected?
I think, well, there were a couple. One is just a personal one. I learned that although Walter Mondale has lived his life in this rough and tumble world of politics, he's a very sensitive person. He's very sensitive to criticism. He's very concerned about how he's perceived. Has a great reverence for intellectuals and for opinion makers, and is very concerned about how they perceive him. And that was surprising. You think of people who are in politics as being just immune to it all.
Or tough-skinned.
Having tough skin. And Mondale does not. And another part of that, too, is that I think it's so easy, we so frequently disparage politicians and look at them as shallow people who are simply out for personal gain. And when you look at Walter Mondale and you look at his career, I developed a great amount of respect for him and for the profession.
Robert Kennedy, for example, called it an honorable profession many times, as did others.
Yeah, and I think it's a profession that can be abused like any other profession. But the people who I dealt with, who worked with Walter Mondale and who were around Walter Mondale, were among the brightest, most interesting and dedicated people who I've had the opportunity to deal with in my life.
You mentioned sensitivity to criticism. In your book, you mentioned that there were things that you said about him with which he did not agree.
That's right.
What were some of the things that he didn't agree with?
Well, there are two, I think. The one that I think we battled over the most was my interpretation of his role as vice president, and particularly his differences with Jimmy Carter. I have an account in the book that Mondale, at one point in the spring of 1979, considered resigning. He was so frustrated. And Mondale denies that took place, feels that I have exaggerated his differences with Jimmy Carter, and is concerned that Carter and other people will read this book and say that Mondale is trying to distance himself from Carter, which is not the case, because it's not Mondale's book, it's mine. And it's my interpretation, not his.
Did you have a chance to speak to President Carter?
I submitted questions to him, and he responded to the questions. And in many cases confirmed the suspicions that I had of Mondale's differences with him on major substantive policy questions.
What was the other item that...
The other is just the '84 campaign. I think he feels that I was not sympathetic enough to the difficulty of the task that he had in front of him, and that I focused too much on the mistakes that he made and the weaknesses of his candidacy, and give credit to, whenever he says that whenever I give credit to someone, it's to someone other than him,
else?
But he gets all the blame. And my main concern in writing this book was not that Walter Mondale liked it, but that a reasonable reader would find it fair-minded and balanced. I think that's the first objective of being a good historian, is to convince your reader of being fair.
Let me ask you a general question and then a couple of specifics as well. One of the words, and there's a pair of them, but one of the words that comes up an awful lot in the book is the word liberal. Have you figured out what the word liberal means?
No, but if anyone has a definition, I'd like to hear it. It changes. I mean, liberalism is a state of mind. It's a philosophy that changes in response to changing circumstances. And liberals in the 19th century were Jeffersonians who were fearful of centralized government. In the 20th century, liberals were advocates of an expansive federal government to compensate for the power of business.
So it is a shifting definition.
It shifts. And
Same with being a conservative.
That's right. That's right. If you look at the periods of liberal reform in the 20th century alone, the New Deal is very different from the New Freedom of Woodrow Wilson. And the Great Society in the 1960s is much different from the liberalism of the New Deal. It addresses issues which Franklin Roosevelt never had to address. So it evolves based on changing circumstances. So it's not a static idea or a static definition. And one of the things I try to do in the book is define liberalism based on Mondale's philosophy. And I have a section in there where I talk about Mondale just before he went into the Senate.
Yeah.
And I took his speeches and analyzed his speeches and tried to draw out of that what was the political philosophy that was guiding him. What was liberalism as defined by Walter Mondale? And that liberalism of 1964 is much different from the liberalism of 1984 when Walter Mondale was running for the presidency. So even in one person, over a period of 20 years, the definition of what is a liberal changes. So it's hard to pin down, although the Republicans have tried in recent years to define a liberal for us in a way that has lots of negative connotations.
Usually as an alien.
That's right. Well, someone who was like a Michael Dukakis. They defined Dukakis as a liberal with all the negative connotations, and Dukakis ran away from the label. And Clinton, I think, to a large extent, has been very careful to keep his distance from the liberal label. Because in the public mind, I think in the last 20 years or so, it has become a label that that is not held in, that it's not respected.
High regard.
High regard.
You mentioned the 1984 campaign
Yeah.
and your view that some mistakes were made by the Mondale campaign. What were some of those mistakes, looking back?
Well, I think
Whether Walter Mondale agrees with you or not on
Yeah.
that.
Well, there were mistakes, but they were not. One of the things I try to do is to point out the forces with which Mondale had to contend. I like Henry Adams once said that politics is at bottom a struggle not of personalities but of forces. And I think it's important in 1984 to understand the tremendous difficulty that Mondale had, the difficult task he had in front of him. And I think if he made mistakes, they were the principal mistake was that he never understood the role of the media in modern campaigns. He stubbornly refused to use the techniques which have become second nature to modern politicians. Walter Mondale tried to campaign for the presidency the same way that Hubert Humphrey ran for the Senate in 1984. It was Mondale was a believer in consensus and building coalitions. And he never appreciated, I think, that there's a much larger audience on the other side of the television lens than there is in the room in front of you. So he would go to an audience and, like Humphrey, his mentor, try to arouse enthusiasm and convince the audience that he was the person who would best represent their interest if he were in the White House. But what he didn't realize was that through the filtered through the lens, that same appeal appeared to be pandering to special interests.
Lots of other groups were watching that had
That's right.
differing views or
That's
different
right.
wishes.
That's right. And what Republicans have learned so well, and what Reagan was the master of, was identifying with certain core values and ideals which we all share as Americans, and transmitting those in 15-second snippets over television. So you don't have to deal with issues, or you don't have to deal with complexity. You simply present a compelling image that taps into people's identification with being American and not with their association to a particular group.
Does that in some way reflect a problem with the way the media covers campaigns like this?
I think it does. I think the media has not figured out how to deal with campaigns.
What would your advice be? If you were advising the media instead of a political campaign, what would you advise the media to do on behalf of the electorate?
I would advise the media to stop taking so many polls, to stop turning it into a day in and day out who won, who lost, like a football game, and be more independent. The media allows the candidates to determine what images they're going to present on the evening news.
So if the candidate has a good media person running the show,
Yeah, they are much more effective.
they control the media.
Yeah, they're able to control the media and channel the media into focusing on whatever they want their message to be. And I think the media has to be willing to simply not, unless a candidate has something substantive to say, the media should simply not cover an event and not just show balloons and cheerleaders and sunny skies and white people. That the media, if a president or a candidate who's running for office is not engaging in a meaningful discussion, then just don't cover it. So you force them, you control the agenda, and you force the candidates to address the issues that you feel are important.
Looking at what you've learned and studied, what would you say Walter Mondale's most difficult and positive accomplishments were?
I think his most difficult moment came during the 1984 campaign, when he finally came to realize he simply could not understand why working class white America was not listening to him. It was, for him, shocking to run against Ronald Reagan and to try to deal substantively with these difficult issues of the budget deficit and just have people not listen to him. So he was mystified by
He was
mystified. He was confused. He could simply not, all that he had learned about politics, it seemed in 1984, was of no benefit to him. And if anything, it worked against him, because it led him to try to address these issues in a way that no one would care to listen. So I think that last month of the campaign was very difficult for him. His greatest legacy, I think, was in his redefining the nature of the vice presidency. Walter Mondale, I think, is the most significant figure to occupy the office of vice president. He has done more to redefine the office than anyone has done in the 200 or odd years.
And what is the substance of that? What, apart from the importance or the significance, what do you mean? What are the details behind that?
The office of vice president had been a ceremonial office. Vice presidents had never had much authority, very little input in policy decisions. They spent their time going around to funerals, and every now and then a president would assign a vice president to some task, to a particular function. When Mondale came in, and in his first meeting with Carter, he brought in a memo where he outlined what he saw the vice president being. And he saw the vice president as an assistant president, the only other person in the executive branch who could have access across the board to material, to information, and who could be an advisor across the board. So he resisted any attempt to get tied down in a particular line item or a particular responsibility. He also had staff placed in key positions in the National Security Council and a Domestic Policy Council, so that he could not be cut off by staff and aides. And he developed a close personal rapport with the president. He had a lunch with President Carter once a week. And people knew they could come to Mondale. He could be a lobbyist in the administration. And he and Carter were two very different people with very different political philosophies. Mondale came from the Humphrey liberal wing of the party. Carter was a very conservative Southerner. And Mondale was able to use the vice presidency to try to lobby on behalf of those things that he felt were important and which he felt would help expand Carter's base with those groups which were very skeptical of him. And so in the way he defined the way the president and the vice president relate to one another, he made a significant contribution. And both George Bush and Dan Quayle have modeled their vice presidency after Walter Mondale. Both actually read the Mondale memo that Mondale had written for Carter. His influence did not always have an impact, especially as inflation became more serious. Carter frequently rejected Mondale's advice, but he changed the nature of the vice presidency, and I don't think it'll ever be the same after him.
Having gotten to know Mondale on something of a personal level, what do you think he is the most proud of?
He always says that the highest office he ever held was the nominee of the Democratic Party for president in 1984. He had been a senator, he had been the vice president of the United States, but he takes great pride in having been the spokesman for the Democratic Party and having had the opportunity to clarify his position and the party's position on major policies. People in 1984 were not ready to listen to what he had to say, and he realizes that, and I think it hurts him a great deal. But I think he takes satisfaction in knowing that in recent years, as we reassess the 1980s, that people are beginning to see him and what he stood for in a different light, and a much more favorable light.
What has his post-political life been like? Have you learned anything about his activities since leaving government?
Yeah, it's been very quiet. I think he, in the couple of years after the election in 1984, he had a very difficult time, I think, readjusting to being a private citizen. He had spent his entire adult life in public office or in some form of public life. And now, he said at one point, he said, one day you walk outside and you have newspaper people and photographers and reporters from around the world. The next day you walk out, not even your dog looks at you. And that was a difficult adjustment for him. And he's also someone who, from an early age, from growing up in Elmore, he listened to his father preach about the virtues of public service. And I think he has this, although he felt rejected and felt that that people did not hear what he wanted to say, he still had this real desire, this commitment to being involved in public service, and I think is frustrated with private life. I think he gets a lot of, he finds it satisfying. It's provided him with financial security, which he had never had before. But I think deep down inside, Mondale loves public life and misses it a great deal.
Do you think he'd like back in?
I don't know. I don't know. I think on one level, I think he would, but on another level, I think Mondale has a great sense of dignity and pride, and he doesn't want to be someone who constantly is running for office. He's had his moment, and I think he's ready and willing to walk away from it. If he could have been appointed to an office, or if he was confident that he could win an election, he may consider it. But I think at this point, I think Walter Mondale plans to remain a private citizen.
Well, thank you very much for discussing this with us today, and I hope that you enjoyed the discussion. Please take advantage of the book. It's a wonderful book, a careful book, and a thorough book. I think you'll find it thought-provoking as well as enlightening.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.